This is serious business, very, very serious business. Having served 30 years in the other body, I've seen the panorama of legislative challenges in that period, and indeed prior thereto, I served for 5 years in the Pentagon and the Department of Defense and testified for the Congress. But this particular moment in our history is critical. And future generations will look back at this day and tomorrow and in the future and see what we did and maybe what we didn't do. So I thank you, the leadership, both the Democrat and Republican of this committee, for taking the initiative and the members to make it work. I think also the committee should pause to express its appreciation to the extraordinary number of organizations, largely the ones I work with today or the nonprofits, but indeed the corporate and business sectors of our country have come together, and I think there's a good, strong, constructive dialogue going on. Unfortunately, we're greeted, as the Vice President and I were talking this morning, by articles like the one in the New York Times this morning. But let's hope that's behind us, and that as members of Congress and as witnesses, we come here and speak the absolute truth, and if I may underline, speak in such a way that all levels of America can understand what the challenges are before us, the complexity, the long, rough road ahead to reach those goals that hopefully this legislation will establish, and that my beloved Senate will join in a conference and will get a law. All too often, I have watched, and each of us have, the advertisements today, and they oversimplify the problem. I mean, you see very attractive actors and actresses get out and say, well, clean coal technology is just around the corner. We know it's not around the corner. They talk about, well, wind power. Wind and solar are vital parts of working our way out of this situation. But each of those requires substantial planning, engineering, tax subsidies, support. Take, for instance, we're talking about the smart grid. It looks to be a quicker approach to begin to correct things with that smart grid. But to do it, we're going to have to work through condemnation laws to get the land over which those grids have got to travel, particularly to convey the energy from the very valuable and abundant source of wind. I saw the other day where in California, the solar panels are using an extraordinary amount of water. So when you go into one situation, you've got to figure out what it affects adversely in the other. So this is a tough road ahead of us, and I'm glad the leadership of this House of Representatives has tackled it and going to move forward. The Vice President very carefully carried a lot of the factual material here this morning, and I won't try and repeat it. I would ask unanimous consent my entire statement go in.
Without objection.
Because I want to move through somewhat swiftly so we can take the questions and actually hear from the membership. Since I've retired or left the Senate, I've continued to work in this area and will continue to do so because I feel very strongly committed. I was privileged for 14 months in the Senate to join with my very good friend, Joseph Lieberman, an extraordinary, courageous legislator, in putting together our bill. And with the support of our chairman, Senator Boxer, and a lean but nevertheless majority of the Senate, I was the only Republican that cast the vote to get that bill out. And I don't say that in any derogatory sense towards my colleagues. I respect their views. But I think as we go along, and one of the things that I go back and wish we had done was to give a little territory to get that bill through. And we didn't perhaps give enough territory to begin to get at least a greater deliberation than the few days on the Senate floor to have laid a stronger foundation for this committee and other elements of the Congress to cover this subject. I want to talk about that foundation. In my judgment, this subject of climate change, the future of energy, and our national security are all interwoven very closely. And I hope that the Congress recognizes that they've got to build their legislation on a foundation with 3 legs on it: the energy leg, the global climate change leg, and the national security leg. And it's that national security that I want to dwell on here for a few minutes, because I think that's the most significant contribution I can make. I want to credit many national security experts who have expressed their concerns, most of which I share. Many senior retired officers, and I say with a sense of humility, I've had an opportunity, many years in the Pentagon, many years in the Congress on the Armed Services Committee, to work with these same officers today who are retired. They don't have a political bone in their system. They're only speaking out in terms of their projection of the responsibilities for the armed forces of the United States as this global situation appears to worsen. And I'll address the specifics on that. But I don't often like to take quotes, but this one I think is worthy of your attention. One extraordinary soldier, one I worked with, and you did too, Mr. Vice President, the former Chief of Staff of the United States Army, General Gordon Sullivan, who chaired the Military Advisory Board on the Center for Naval Analysis. That center has done a lot of valuable work in this area. Succinctly framed the situation as follows. The Cold War, and he's referencing, of course, the former Soviet Union. The Cold War was a specter, but climate change is inevitable. If we keep on with business as usual, we will reach a point where some of the worst effects are inevitable. Back then, the challenge was to stop a particular action. Now the challenge is to inspire a particular action. We have to act if we are to avoid the worst of the effects. If I may, I was hoping that Chairman Dingell would be here today. I want to go back and just a brief personal recollection. I grew up during the Great Depression and then the years of World War II. I was privileged to, in the last year of the war, wear the uniform of a young sailor when my distinguished colleague, Chairman Dingell, was really in the thick of the fighting. Well, you are now. But our generation was referred to as the greatest generation. But the thing about it is, and I don't want to be too prosaic, but I think back of the inspiration that it took to get through those periods in America. Went back and read that wonderful speech given by Franklin D. Roosevelt in his first inaugural. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. There's a very substantial element of fear attached to this subject. Now, we are, as a nation, together with other nations in the world, facing one of the most unprecedented and difficult economic situation ever in history. We also have our brave men and women of the armed forces fighting 2 wars. And the question is raised, is this the time to challenge an issue of this magnitude, which has ramifications of cost to everyone here in this country, and is going to require sacrifices? And I say to you, as my distinguished colleague said, yes, it is the time. I witnessed personally the nation survive those trials of the Depression and the war, and then emerge and redevelop itself and become a stronger nation, stronger than any of us ever imagined we could achieve in the late 40s and 50s. We can do that again, but it's going to take your leadership. We will do it again. We have to, because every day that goes by increases the cost, as I understand it, involved in this situation. Let me say that one thing that we've got going for us as legislators is that there is a desire among a broad cross-section of the American people to do something. They want it done. They don't understand all the complexity and all the technical things, but instinctively they're saying, we're with you. But the duty we have is to be honest with them, tell them it's going to be a burden, and tell them it's going to take time. I mean, clean coal technologies, which is so important to my state, Virginia. And I've looked into this question of capture and sequestration and transfer and sequestration. That's going to take big bucks and a lot of time to perfect it. So I say to you most respectfully, as I look back at the legislation that we put forward in the Senate, we had in there provisions, and I used to characterize it that the President of the United States as the engineer driving this big train. He had the throttle to push, he had the brake to slow down. In order to allow our power sector, our engineering sector, transportation sector, manufacturing sector, to do the job that I think in their heart instinctively they want to do, we've got to give them the assurance that the timetables we establish have got to be such that they can keep pace with their responsibility to meet the needs of the citizens today, and at the same time engage in the research and development of the solutions that we have, but to do it in a timely fashion. The most challenging thing for this committee and this legislation is to devise that language, to give the President, and the President has stepped forward and shown a measure of strong leadership on this subject and a willingness to work with the Congress. But we've got to devise that language that enables the President, and indeed the people in this country, to do work that's got to be done in such a way that we don't put on the burden that they have to bear before the technology has been done and the infrastructure installed for them to continue. I mean, in the coal industry, if we move too swiftly, coal is likely to switch to natural gas. Now, natural gas, people think is, you listen to some of them, it's pure, but it has 50% of the greenhouse carbon and so forth. Am I not correct? As does coal. And we don't have identified yet the sources of gas to meet that demand if the power industry suddenly were forced as a matter of necessity so as not to violate the law to shift to gas. So give to the President the language. I wrote it in the previous bill, and I hope that you can even do a better job to give the President the authority to correct certain situations if this country cannot meet its obligations under the law. So if I were in the Senate today, I would be doing one other thing, and that is I would be working to try and incorporate language, I hope in both bodies, that would recognize the enormous benefit of bringing to the table. You had commerce, you had energy, you had transportation at this table, but bring to the table the defense sector, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and certain elements of the infrastructure in the private sector that support our defense, and let them express their views. Let them be charged by the Congress in this legislation for the accountability to do their share to reach these goals. Because, as the Vice President cited, the effects of climate change, and I'm not here to argue the science, but certainly the reality. He spoke about the Arctic, the Antarctic, and the North Pole, and so forth. We were talking about those submarines, and how they had to do the scientific work to determine the thickness of the ice, and how that database, which was begun in 1958, now shows you how much that has shrunk over a period of time. But it's the members of the military that will be called upon to help those nations who, as a consequence of the erratic nature of climate change, could be losing their sovereignty, suffering mass migrations, political instability, creating a vacuum. So many of these nations are now on the verge of political collapse, and this push from a climactic condition could shove them over where they lose their sovereignty. Somalia is an example of that, with the droughts on that littoral of Africa. We've got to be sure that we're doing everything to alleviate these situations, because we're the only country that has the military capability, particularly the lift capability, the transportation capability, to get there in a timely way and do what we can in a humanitarian way to alleviate the suffering that is occasioned by these situations. Stability in the world is absolutely critical. And we're called upon, as you said, Mr. Vice President, we are the leader. We are the one that has the strongest of the militaries. And we will be called upon. To the extent that our military has to perform missions occasioned by climatic conditions or others, is the extent to which they have less ability to do missions elsewhere. So there's a direct cause and effect between what our military are called upon to do our normal role of protecting freedom in the world and to meet these situations. Whether it's crop failures or famine, disease, mass migration of people across borders, destruction of the vital infrastructure, all of these things can lead to failed nations and instability. So I just want to conclude by saying we're the best equipped, we're prepared. The United States has always been of a soft heart to help those less fortunate than ourselves, and this poses a real problem. I go back to one other admiral. I served with him when he was NATO commander, NATO South. And he said, as part of the military advisory board, national security and the threat of climate change. He said, this is Admiral Joseph Lopez. I think Joe has only voted. I don't know if he's ever done anything in the political world. I've known him that well. And he said, you have a very real change in natural systems that are most likely to happen in regions of the world that are already fertile ground for extremism. That sums it up. And delaying action on this just raises costs, leaves us less prepared to try to alleviate the stress that will be put on our military. So I strongly urge that you look at the possibility of injecting in this record somewhere the views of our departments and hopefully language which will hold them accountable and make them as much a partner as the other departments and agencies of our government. And I'm sure my good friend, Congressman Ike Skelton, can work with you to see that happens. Thank you very much.